Well, it's all about China once again in Australian politics. Should we be concerned? What action should we take? And how do we balance that off against our trade interests? We've heard reaction today, a lot of this stemming from Andrew Hastie's column last week, a backbencher, but also someone, of course, with a military background and head of the powerful and bipartisan Security Committee here in Parliament. Reaction this morning from Jim Molan, who believes his government, when he was a part of it and he wants to be a part of the government again, has been taking this seriously and taking action.
You don't have to call out a threat specifically if that will be a self-fulfilling prophecy in order to prepare for that threat. And there are other ways to get around it. My view of China is that we must welcome China and the rise of China. What China has done for its own people, as we all know, is just unbelievable. We must welcome China, but we must welcome China from a position of strength, not just military strength, financial, economic, and every other aspect of what this magnificent country is.
Current Senator Amanda Stoker was also asked about this today on Sky News and said she didn't necessarily think Trade Minister Simon Birmingham and some of the other people supporting Andrew Hastie's comments were on a different page here. It's about economic interests and security interests.
Well, I can understand why Senator Birmingham's got a real interest around the trade perspective, because that's an important focus for him. But Mr Hastie's looking at it from a different perspective, and they are both important. So let's take all of those views, put them on the table and find a path forward for the future that takes into account all those considerations.
Joining me live now is Professor John Blaxland, Professor in International Securities, amongst other things, at ANU. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me on the program, Tom.
A lot of reaction to this and a lot of people, questioning why this was even said and if it was helpful. Scott Morrison just spoke about not wanting to make the situation more complex. Are we afraid to even talk about this?
Yeah, it does seem that way. And I think Andrew Hastie has been verbaled by China in characterising his remarks as about Nazism and the parallels with China. That's not what he was doing. He was talking about a Maginot Line mentality, which is about the West, about Australia and our ability to be nimble-minded and adaptive to the changing circumstances.
So France's folly back then, nothing to do with China being the Third Reich?
No, not at all, and that's the point. And it's very interesting that China should be so sensitive to go out on a limb and criticise Andrew Hastie for his remarks, verballing him and basically mischaracterising what he said. It speaks to a couple of things. One is a hypersensitivity to issues being raised, which speaks to concerns within China about their own domestic issues and how they manage things and how they manage external relations. But also how it works in terms of relations in Australia. And so they've been very, very forthright about seeking their way in getting Australia to be pretty hush-hush and basically conceding ground without Australia being forced to, on a number of policy fronts, this being one of them. Of course, we've seen a strong nexus between trade and security, that getting closer and closer.
Well, one of the interesting parts here, even as you've had Australian ministers talking out about things such as the re-education camps, put them in inverted commas, for Uyghurs, the surveillance state that China's turned into, militarisation of the South China Sea and military bases in our region, even helping North Korea avoiding too many, crippling sanctions, essentially. So, comments on that we try to say, well, they're speaking out, and yet right now you've just had the Trade Minister Simon Birmingham saying, please let in our coal. How effective are these protestations when we're still saying, please keep this element of trade, please allow us to keep profiting?
Well, this is the thing. We are being sandwiched between policies on security and policies on trade and economics. And we do need to be very careful. It is appropriate that we are circumspect, but Andrew Hastie wasn't being inappropriate. This is the point. He's verbaled. What he said was actually not unreasonable. And China is throwing its weight around, and it's basically, this is a slowly developing scenario we're seeing here that's a little bit like a slowly slowly boiling frog in a pot that's slowly being warmed up. Essentially, the policy we're seeing develop in Australia is that the government is being pressured to concede ground in terms of its willingness to support the United States and its objections to China's actions in the South China Sea, in Cambodia, in the South Pacific. And it's doing that incrementally. So pushing back on Andrew Hastie, burbeling him there, does generate a backlash that will, is seen as being something that will perhaps concede a little bit of ground, something that can be taken further. But what we've seen with Josh Frydenberg's remarks, I think, is very telling, because Australians need to realise the scale and the gravity of the challenges we're facing, and we do need to recognise that Australia actually, for the past 70 years, has made a choice about being allied with the United States and the consequences of doing that. Now, China is basically looking to get us to back down. And we've heard that from a number of pundits saying, there's a choice we've got to make. We've made a choice. China is looking for us to change that choice. And there are consequences of us not changing our minds. In other words, China is basically adding pressure on us to change our approach towards the United States, change our approach to the neighbours.
But the recent white paper was basically talking about how our alliance was doing the world no good with the US.
Well, see, this is where I would take issue with that. I mean, the alliance is making a significant contribution. When we look at our neighbourhood, when we look at Indonesia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, they look to Australia as a bit of a benchmark. We are very much a country that sets the limits for what is acceptable for how we engage with China, and they look to us for a demonstration effect. What Australia says, what Australia does, has clear consequences in terms of how the neighbourhood responds, because if Australia makes concessions to China, then the neighbourhood feels that they probably do too. And if Australia stands up and says, thus far no further, that sends a very strong signal to the neighbourhood about space that they can operate in.
So this is the big part, isn't it? Where's that line? What is the line? And you look back, well, here's another parallel to the Second World War, appeasement. You look at Xi going to US soil and saying, there won't be militarisation of the South China Sea. Next thing we knew, there were runways being built. At what point you do stand up and say, no, sorry, no further, even though it's so incremental. This is the frog in water. It might be 86 degrees. At what point do you say 87's too far?
Yes. Well, this gets to the question about what's at stake and what are the risks. And I think it's important to understand and be clear-headed about the fact that while China may well bluster about threats to our trade and our economic interests, the bottom line is that China does not trade with Australia because it likes our liberal Western democracy. It does so because it's a good deal. And that remains the case. Now, the idea that we would make concessions because of our liberal Western democratic principles is, I think, a fallacious one. It's a dangerous one.
There can still be that punishment. So I suppose the more countries that stand up and say no more, the harder it is for China to mete out that punishment. But do we need to look at this right now and say we're so inextricably linked with China in an economic sense? The real issue is saying, where do we want to be in 10 years? In 15 years, how diverse, how independent of China in an economy, not to cut them off, of course, they wouldn't care, even if that means some economic pain over the next 15 years, to make sure if things do ratchet up, we can keep functioning?
Well, I think there's going to be some economic pain, and we need to make some adjustments. I do think...
And hear that from our politicians? This might cost us, but we need to do this?
Well, it's very hard for politicians who are looking for, in marginal electorates to make that call in advance of something dramatic happening. It's people like you and I talking about it.
Without the event happening, you mean?
Exactly.
You need to build the case that this is what could happen.
Yeah, and it's very hard to go there when you want to. People are trying to have a bob each way. And while we can, we should be exploiting all of the economic opportunities we can for our benefit and for the benefit of our children and our grandchildren. But we need to be doing with our eyes well and truly open, sober-minded as to the ramifications of our choices and our willingness to concede politically just for apparent short-term economic gains.
Just about out of time, but just finally, do you see much willingness to make this case at the moment?
Look, momentum is growing. There's a greater dawning realisation of the gravity of the scale we're facing, the challenges we're facing, and the costs that we may, as a nation, need to bear. And that means being prepared to take economic hits in the short term. Remember that Australia is one of the most prosperous countries in the world. We are quite diverse trade-wise. Yes, China is prominent, but it is not overwhelming the case. Yes, it's a very significant part of our trade, but it needs us as much as we need China. So this idea that China is able to just, blithely cut off trade with us to spite us, it will spite itself. And at this time, when it's facing so many challenges in its terms of its relationship with the United States, it really has to weigh that up as well. So we're actually in a pretty strong position, and we shouldn't underestimate it.
And not to forget its sort of unofficial compact of strong growth in return for strong power as well.
And we want China to continue growing.
Yeah.
We want it to also be a country that is accepting of its neighbours, accepting of Australia's diversity and of our liberal principles, and not have to basically kowtow and compromise on our principles, as they seem to be wanting us to do over Andrew Hastie's remarks and remarks of that ilk that are what we've taken for granted as being part of what we do in a Western liberal democracy.
Professor John Blaxland, always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.